They called it the most terrifying war machine in history, steel symbols, marching boots, and a leader who promised a 1,000-year empire. But what if that image was a lie? What if Hitler's Germany, loud, brutal, and feared, was actually weaker than the Germany that came before it? Not weaker in hatred, but weaker where wars are truly won: leadership, strategy, and discipline. Tonight, we strip away the propaganda, the myths, and the fear to uncover a truth history rarely tells. And once you see it, you'll never look at Nazi Germany the same way again. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. They wore the same colors. They marched beneath the same iron symbols. And to the outside world, they looked terrifyingly similar. But history, when you listen closely, tells a different story. Because Nazi Germany, loud, brutal, and aggressive, was in many ways weaker than the Imperial Germany that came before it. Not weaker in cruelty, not weaker in ambition, but weaker in the things that truly decide wars: discipline, unity, structure, and strategic clarity. This is not the story we are usually told. This is the story beneath the propaganda. Imperial Germany, a state built for war in 1914. Imperial Germany did not stumble into war. It prepared for it for decades. Its officer corps was professional, methodical, and deeply educated in military science. German generals like Moltke the Elder and Schlieffen believed war was not about passion. It was about planning, logistics, and timing. The German general staff functioned almost like a machine. Promotions were based on merit. Decisions were debated, refined, and tested. Politics rarely interfered with battlefield command. Even the Kaiser, for all his flaws, did not micromanage troop movements the way later leaders would. Imperial Germany understood a hard truth. A war is not won by shouting orders. It is won by managing systems. And for a time, that system worked. Nazi Germany, power built on illusion. Hitler's Germany, by contrast, was a state built on emotion, rage, fear, humiliation. The Nazi war machine looked unstoppable. Lightning-fast tanks, screaming Stukas, black uniforms marching in perfect rhythm. But behind the spectacle was chaos. Hitler did not trust institutions, he did not trust experts, and above all, he did not trust generals who told him the truth. Where Imperial Germany encouraged debate, Nazi Germany punished disagreement. Generals learned quickly: say what Hitler wants to hear, or lose your command. Question ideology, or disappear. Admit reality, or be labeled a traitor. This created a fatal weakness, a leadership afraid of honesty. The destruction of professional command. Imperial Germany's generals planned wars. Nazi Germany's generals survived politics. Hitler steadily dismantled the professional military culture Germany once prized. He bypassed the general staff. He issued direct battlefield orders with no military training. He overruled experienced commanders based on intuition and ideology. By 1941, German officers were no longer strategists. They were courtiers, waiting for approval from a man who believed willpower could replace supply lines. Imperial Germany respected logistics. Nazi Germany ignored them. And wars do not forgive such arrogance. Ideology is a weapon against itself. Imperial Germany fought enemies. Nazi Germany fought entire populations. Hitler's racial ideology drained Germany's strength. Millions of potential workers were murdered. Brilliant scientists and engineers were exiled or killed. Occupied territories were brutalized instead of integrated. Where Imperial Germany tried to manage conquered lands pragmatically, Nazi Germany ruled through terror, creating resistance everywhere it went. Every partisan, every uprising, every sabotage operation was a consequence of ideology replacing strategy. Hatred feels powerful, but it is terribly inefficient. A war on too many fronts. Again, but worse, Imperial Germany made a fatal mistake in World War I by fighting on multiple fronts. But it did so reluctantly, aware of the risk. Hitler repeated the mistake deliberately. He declared war on enemies he did not need to fight. He invaded the Soviet Union without securing long-term resources. He antagonized allies and ignored economic reality. Imperial Germany lost a war it almost survived. Nazi Germany launched a war it could never sustain. Because unlike 1914, by 1943, Germany was not just fighting armies. It was fighting time, industry, fuel shortages, and internal collapse. Fear is not strength. Here is the deepest difference. Imperial Germany ruled through authority. Nazi Germany ruled through fear. Fear silences truth. Fear destroys trust. Fear leads men to lie, especially to dictators. By the end, German officers were reporting victories that did not exist, divisions that were already destroyed, and supplies that would never arrive. Hitler believed them, and Germany paid the price. The final irony of power. The world remembers Nazi Germany as the ultimate symbol of military terror, but terror is not strength. Imperial Germany was a flawed empire, authoritarian, aggressive, and dangerous, yet it was coherent. Hitler's Germany was louder, more violent, more radical, and because of that, it was weaker in leadership, weaker in unity, weaker in judgment. History's cruel lesson is this: a nation can be armed to the teeth and still destroy itself from within. And no amount of banners, speeches, or blind loyalty can save a state that confuses rage for power and obedience for strength. Imperial Germany entered the 20th century with one of the most professional military institutions the world had ever seen. Its strength did not come from slogans or spectacle, but from an obsessive commitment to structure, education, and institutional memory. The German General Staff was not simply a group of officers, it was an intellectual system. Officers were trained to think in probabilities, logistics, and long-term consequences. They were expected to challenge assumptions, debate plans, and refine ideas through rigorous analysis. War in this system was not romanticized. It was treated as a complex scientific problem that demanded discipline and humility before reality. The General Staff selected its officers through merit rather than loyalty. Advancement depended on competence, performance, and mastery of military theory. This created a culture where disagreement was not only tolerated but required. A flawed plan was considered more dangerous than a critical subordinate. Senior commanders expected their staff to point out weaknesses, calculate risks, and offer alternatives. Even the Kaiser, despite his personal authority, rarely interfered directly in operational planning. His role was symbolic and political. The machinery of war remained in professional hands. This separation between political power and military execution allowed Imperial Germany to mobilize with speed and coordination unmatched in Europe in 1914. Planning was the core of this system. Decades before the First World War, German officers studied railway timetables, supply chains, industrial capacity, and mobilization speed. They understood that modern war was not decided by courage alone, but by the ability to move millions of men and tons of material with precision. The Schlieffen Plan, for all its flaws, reflected this mindset. It was not an emotional reaction, but the product of years of study, debate, and revision. Imperial Germany believed that wars were won or lost before the first shot was fired, in offices filled with maps, statistics, and contingency plans. This culture also created continuity. When commanders died or were replaced, the institution remained. Orders were issued through established channels, decisions followed doctrine, and personal ambition was subordinated to the system. Even in crisis, the army functioned because it trusted its procedures. Officers were trained to operate independently within clear strategic goals, allowing flexibility on the battlefield without descending into chaos. This was a military designed to survive stress, not one dependent on the mood or instincts of a single leader. Nazi Germany inherited this professional tradition but systematically dismantled it. Adolf Hitler distrusted institutions that he did not personally control. He viewed expertise as a threat and debate as weakness. From the beginning, he sought to turn the army from a professional force into an extension of his will. Loyalty to the Führer became more important than loyalty to doctrine or truth. Officers learned that their careers depended less on military competence and more on their ability to align themselves with Hitler's worldview and expectations. The process was gradual but relentless. Independent thinkers were sidelined, dismissed, or driven into retirement. The General Staff, once the intellectual heart of the German military, was stripped of its authority. Strategic planning gave way to improvisation guided by ideology and personal intuition. Hitler increasingly bypassed established command structures, issuing direct orders to field commanders from afar. These orders often ignored local conditions, logistical realities, and the advice of experienced officers on the ground. Fear replaced professionalism as the primary motivator. Generals who contradicted Hitler risked humiliation, dismissal, or worse. This created an atmosphere where honesty became dangerous. Reports were altered to appear more optimistic. Setbacks were minimized and failures were blamed on subordinates or external forces. Over time, Hitler received a distorted picture of reality, one shaped by the fear of those around him. Decisions were made not on accurate information, but on what he wanted to believe. Micromanagement became a defining feature of Nazi Germany's war effort. Hitler involved himself in decisions that Imperial Germany would have left to colonels and majors. He dictated troop movements, forbade tactical withdrawals, and insisted on holding ground regardless of cost. Where imperial doctrine emphasized flexibility and operational freedom, Hitler demanded absolute obedience. The result was paralysis. Commanders were afraid to adapt to changing circumstances without explicit permission, even when delay meant destruction. This interference grew more severe as the war turned against Germany. Instead of empowering professionals to manage crisis, Hitler tightened his grip. He believed that willpower could overcome material shortages and that ideological conviction could substitute for fuel, ammunition, and manpower. The professional language of logistics and planning was replaced by rhetoric about destiny and sacrifice. Imperial Germany had treated war as a problem to be solved. Nazi Germany treated it as a test of faith. The consequences were catastrophic. Supply lines collapsed under unrealistic demands. Units were ordered to hold positions that could not be supplied or reinforced. Entire armies were sacrificed because withdrawal was seen as disloyalty. In the Soviet Union, experienced commanders understood the need for strategic retreats and elastic defense. But Hitler's refusal to allow them led to encirclements that destroyed hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers. A professional system would have absorbed losses and adapted. A micromanaged system shattered under pressure. The contrast between the two eras reveals a deeper truth about power and weakness. Imperial Germany's strength lay not in the brilliance of any single leader, but in the resilience of its institutions. Nazi Germany concentrated power so completely in one man that the state became vulnerable to his limitations, prejudices, and delusions. When Hitler made mistakes, there was no mechanism to correct them. When he ignored reality, reality did not change. The military became an echo chamber, amplifying his beliefs instead of challenging them. By destroying the independence of the general staff, Nazi Germany destroyed its ability to think strategically. War became reactive rather than planned, emotional rather than calculated. Professional officers were reduced to messengers and executors, stripped of the authority that once allowed German armies to function with coherence. The same nation that had once trusted systems and expertise now relied on intuition and obedience. In the end, difference between Imperial Germany and Hitler's Germany was not simply one of morality or ideology, but of competence, structure, and respect for reality. Imperial Germany built its military culture on the belief that authority had to be earned. From the cadet schools to the highest levels of command, officers were judged by competence, discipline, and their ability to lead men under pressure. Advancement was slow, competitive, and unforgiving. A noble name or political connection could open doors, but it could not carry an officer through the system. Battlefield performance, staff evaluations, and mastery of doctrine determined who rose and who remained behind. This created an army where leadership was respected not because it was feared, but because it had proven itself capable. Trust was the foundation of this system. Soldiers trusted their officers because they knew those men had been trained, tested, and selected through rigorous standards. Junior officers trusted their super IORs because decisions were usually grounded in experience and professional judgment. Even when orders led to terrible losses, there was a shared understanding that those orders were the product of calculation, not whim. Discipline existed, but it was reinforced by credibility. Authority flowed downward, but confidence flowed upward, binding the institution together. Merit-based leadership also created accountability. Officers who failed repeatedly were removed regardless of status. Mistakes were analyzed, documented, and used as teaching tools. The culture encouraged learning from failure rather than hiding it. This did not make Imperial Germany humane or gentle, but it made it functional. The army could absorb setbacks without collapsing because it understood why things had gone wrong and who was responsible. Leadership was a profession, not a performance. Nazi Germany replaced this culture with something far more fragile. Loyalty became more important than ability. Ideological company. Commitment outweighed military education. Hitler valued officers who reinforced his beliefs and distrusted those who spoke in cautious, analytical terms. Promotions increasingly depended on personal favor, political reliability, and enthusiasm for the regime. Competence became optional. Obedience became essential. This shift did not happen overnight, but once it took hold, it reshaped every layer of the armed forces. Fear became the central organizing principle. Officers learned that careers could end with a single disagreement. A raised objection could be interpreted as defeatism. A suggestion to retreat could be seen as cowardice. Under such conditions, self-preservation replaced responsibility. Commanders began to shape their reports to avoid angering superiors rather than to convey reality. Bad news traveled slowly, if at all. The truth became dangerous, and lies became a survival skill. This fear eroded trust at every level. Soldiers sensed when their leaders were uncertain or constrained. Junior officers hesitated to take initiative, worried that independent action might be punished if it failed. Senior commanders second-guessed themselves, torn between military necessity and political risk. The clear chain of confidence that had characterized Imperial Germany fractured. Orders were obeyed, but often without conviction. Discipline remained, but it was hollow, driven by threat rather than respect. The culture of fear also destroyed accountability. Failures were rarely traced back to flawed decisions at the top. Instead, blame flowed downward. Entire units were condemned for outcomes that resulted from impossible orders. Officers were dismissed not for incompetence, but for losing Hitler's favor. This discouraged honest assessment and encouraged scapegoating. A system that cannot admit error cannot correct it, and Nazi Germany steadily lost the ability to learn from its own mistakes. Leadership under fear is inherently rigid. In Imperial Germany, commanders expected to adapt, improvise, and respond to changing conditions. Initiative was encouraged within the framework of doctrine. In Nazi Germany, initiative was risky. Deviating from orders, even when circumstances demanded it, could be fatal to a career. This led to mechanical obedience, where units followed directives long after they had ceased to make sense. Battles were fought according to outdated assumptions because no one dared to challenge them. The psychological toll of this environment was immense. Officers lived under constant pressure, not only from the enemy, but from their own leadership. Stress distorted judgment. Decision-making slowed as commanders waited for approval rather than acting decisively. The fear of being wrong outweighed the fear of defeat. This paralysis was especially evident as the war turned against Germany. Instead of empowering experienced leaders to stabilize the front, the regime intensified its punishments and threats, further undermining effectiveness. Merit-based systems create resilience because they distribute responsibility across many capable individuals. Fear-driven systems concentrate power while dispersing blame. In Nazi Germany, Hitler absorbed authority but deflected responsibility. When victories occurred, they were attributed to his genius. When defeats came, they were blamed on disloyal generals, weak soldiers, or imagined conspiracies. This narrative protected his image but corroded the institution. Officers learned that success brought no security and failure brought ruin, regardless of effort or competence. Over time, the army became a place where survival depended on political instincts rather than military skill. Talented officers were sidelined or silenced, while less capable but more compliant figures advanced. This distorted the leadership pool, leaving critical positions in the hands of men chosen for loyalty rather than ability. The gap between rank and competence widened, weakening operational effecti across the board. Imperial Germany's army could endure strain because its leaders believed in the system and in each other. Nazi Germany's army fractured under pressure because fear isolated individuals and destroyed mutual confidence. Soldiers fought bravely, often heroically, but bravery cannot compensate for broken leadership. When orders are issued from fear and obeyed from fear, the result is not strength but brittleness. The contrast between merit-based command and fear-driven leadership reveals why one system, despite its flaws, functioned under immense pressure, while the other, louder and more ruthless, steadily unraveled as the war progressed. Imperial Germany approached war as a problem that could be understood, measured, and managed. Its leaders believed that emotions were dangerous in strategy, that anger and pride distorted judgment, and that discipline in thought was as important as discipline in ranks. Military planning was treated as a rational process rooted in study and repetition. Officers spent years examining past campaigns, calculating supply requirements, and testing scenarios through war games. Decisions were not made because they felt right, but because they appeared sustainable under scrutiny. This mindset did not eliminate mistakes, but it reduced the chance that those mistakes would be driven by impulse. Strategic planning in Imperial Germany was cumulative. Each generation of officers inherited lessons from the last, refined them, and passed them forward. Doctrine evolved through experience and debate. Even ambitious plans were constrained by assessments of manpower, industry, and time. The German leadership understood that modern war was a contest of systems, not personalities. Victory depended on aligning military objectives with economic capacity and political reality. When assumptions proved wrong, planners attempted to adjust rather than deny the evidence. Emotional restraint shaped command behavior. Senior officers were trained to separate personal pride from operational necessity. Retreat, when required, was not viewed as shameful but as a temporary measure to preserve force. Losses were analyzed coldly, without the need to assign moral meaning to every outcome. This did not make decisions easier, but it made them clearer. Strategy remained anchored to what was possible rather than what was desired. Nazi Germany replaced this analytical culture with one driven by emotion and belief. Adolf Hitler's approach to war was intensely personal. He experienced victories as validation of his destiny and defeats as personal betrayals. Strategic decisions were often reactions to feelings rather than responses to data. Confidence turned into overconfidence, and caution was dismissed as weakness. The early successes of the war reinforced this mindset, convincing Hitler that instinct and willpower mattered more than planning. As a result, long-term strategy suffered. Operations were launched without clear TES, or realistic assessments of cost. Political goals shifted rapidly, and military objectives were adjusted to fit ideological narratives. Instead of asking whether Germany had the resources to achieve a goal, the leadership asked whether the goal aligned with its vision of greatness. When reality contradicted ambition, reality was ignored. Emotional decision-making also distorted the flow of information. Reports were valued for their tone as much as their content. Optimism was rewarded, pessimism was punished. Officers learned to frame their assessments in ways that supported the prevailing mood. This created a feedback loop where emotional expectations shaped reports, and those reports reinforced emotional expectations. Strategic planning became increasingly detached from actual conditions on the ground. Impulse replaced preparation.
Hitler frequently changed plans mid-operation, reacting to perceived slights, symbolic opportunities, or sudden fears.
Campaigns that required patience. CE were disrupted by sudden shifts in priority. Resources were redirected not according to strategic necessity, but according to emotional urgency. This prevented the concentration of effort essential for decisive results. Imperial Germany's planners sought focus. Nazi Germany's leadership created diffusion. The invasion of the Soviet Union illustrated this contrast with brutal clarity. Imperial-style planning would have demanded clear objectives, secured supply lines, and a realistic assessment of distance and climate. Instead, the campaign was launched with sweeping ambitions and vague assumptions. Early victories fueled emotional confidence, leading to expanded goals without expanded resources. When momentum slowed, frustration replaced analysis. Rather than reassessing the plan, the leadership doubled down on belief. Emotional decision-making also affected the treatment of allies and enemies. Nazi Germany alienated potential partners through arrogance and ideological rigidity. Strategic opportunities were sacrificed to emotional contempt. Entire populations were written off as inferior, removing any incentive to win cooperation. This multiplied resistance and drained resources. An analytical approach would have sought stability and exploitation. An emotional approach created chaos and constant conflict. The refusal to accept limits was another consequence of emotion-driven leadership. Imperial planners recognized that resources impose boundaries on ambition. Nazi Germany rejected this idea, treating limitation as defeatism. When shortages emerged, they were explained away as temporary or blamed on disloyalty. This prevented timely adjustments and accelerated collapse. Emotional denial replaced rational adaptation. As the war turned against Germany, emotional decision-making became even more destructive. Anger replaced confidence and bitterness replaced calculation. Orders were issued to satisfy a sense of defiance rather than to achieve strategic effect. Cities were declared fortresses not because they could be held, but because abandoning them felt unacceptable. Sacrifice was demanded as proof of loyalty, regardless of outcome. Strategy ceased to function as a tool for victory and became a stage for emotional expression. Strategic clarity depends on the ability to distinguish goals from feelings. Imperial Germany, despite its aggression and flaws, largely maintained this distinction. Nazi Germany erased it. War became an extension of Hitler's internal state, rising and falling with his moods. When optimism reigned, risks were ignored. When despair set in, destruction was embraced as meaningful in itself. Planning gave way to reaction, and reaction gave way to obsession. The deeper weakness of emotional decision-making is that it narrows perception. Facts that support belief are amplified. Facts that contradict it are dismissed. Options shrink until only emotionally satisfying choices remain. This process was visible in Nazi Germany's conduct of the war, as opportunities for compromise or consolidation were rejected in favor of dramatic gestures. Imperial Germany's leaders sought solutions. Nazi Germany's leadership sought validation. Over time, the gap between ambition and capability widened beyond repair. Emotional decisions accumulated, each one eroding the foundations of strategy. Without careful planning, victories could not be sustained. Without strategic clarity, sacrifices produced no lasting advantage. The contrast between calculated planning and emotional impulse explains why one system, however imperfect, could function coherently under pressure, while the other spiraled into self-destructive escalation as reality asserted itself. Imperial Germany approached warfare with a cold, utilitarian mindset. Its leaders were aggressive and expansionist, but they understood that war was ultimately about control, stability, and extraction of advantage. Occupied territories were viewed as assets to be managed rather than populations to be annihilated. Administration, infrastructure, and local cooperation mattered. Even when repression occurred, it was usually calculated to maintain order and keep resources flowing. Pragmatism, not moral restraint, guided these decisions. The goal was to sustain the war effort by minimizing chaos behind the lines. This pragmatic approach extended to diplomacy and alliance management. Imperial Germany sought partners who could contribute materially to its war aims. It tolerated differences, compromised when necessary, and avoided turning every political disagreement into an existential conflict. Enemies were defined by strategic necessity, not by race or ideology. This allowed for flexibility. Negotiations, ceasefires, and realignments remained conceivable options, even if they were not always pursued successfully. Nazi Germany shattered this pragmatic framework by placing racial ideology at the center of its military strategy. War was no longer just a contest bet. Wien states, but a struggle between imagined biological categories. Entire populations were designated as enemies regardless of their behavior or strategic value. This transformed military occupation into a campaign of extermination and repression. Resources that could have strengthened the war effort were diverted into mass murders, surveillance, and terror. Ideology imposed rigidity where flexibility was essential. Areas that could have been pacified through cooperation were instead brutalized, ensuring constant resistance. Skilled workers were enslaved, starved, or killed, reducing productivity and sabotaging supply chains. Rather than exploiting conquered territories efficiently, Nazi Germany bled itself dry, trying to impose an ideological vision through force. The war effort became entangled with genocidal policies that produced no strategic benefit. This ideological obsession also crippled intelligence and analysis. Information was filtered through racial assumptions. Enemy capabilities were underestimated because they did not fit preconceived hierarchies. Potential allies were dismissed as inferior or unreliable based on ideology rather than evidence. Decisions were made not on what populations could contribute, but on what the regime believed they deserved. This led to catastrophic misjudgments, particularly in Eastern Europe, where hatred replaced assessment. Imperial Germany's leadership, for all its arrogance, understood the value of skilled individuals regardless of origin. Expertise was recognized as a resource. Nazi Germany systematically destroyed this advantage. Jewish scientists, engineers, doctors, and administrators were expelled or murdered, stripping the state of intellectual capital at the very moment it needed innovation and efficiency. Ideological purity was valued above competence, weakening every sector connected to the war effort. The treatment of prisoners of war further illustrates the contrast. Imperial Germany generally adhered to company conventions when it served practical interests, recognizing that reciprocal treatment could protect its own soldiers. Nazi Germany abandoned this logic. Prisoners, particularly from the East, were viewed through a racial lens and subjected to mass death. This policy eliminated any incentive for enemy forces to surrender and harden resistance. Pragmatic warfare seeks to reduce enemy capacity. Ideological warfare ensures total hostility. Ideology also poisoned relationships within the Axis alliance. Partners were treated with suspicion and contempt, undermining coordination. Strategic disagreements became ideological confrontations. Resources were hoarded or misallocated because trust was absent. Imperial Germany, despite tensions with allies, pursued coordination as a necessity. Nazi Germany subordinated alliance cohesion to its racial worldview, weakening collective strength. The economic consequences were profound. Pragmatic occupation policies aimed to stabilize production and transportation. Ideological occupation destroys them. Railways were sabotaged, factories disrupted, harvests burned, all fueled by the resentment generated by brutal policies. The German war economy became increasingly dependent on coercion, which is inefficient and unstable. Forced laborers worked poorly, resisted subtly, and required constant supervision, consuming resources that could have been used elsewhere. Ideology also narrowed strategic imagination. Certain options were never considered because they conflicted with belief. Negotiated settlements, limited objectives, or strategic withdrawals were framed as betrayals of destiny. Imperial Germany's leaders, though stubborn, remained within the realm of statecraft. Nazi Germany transformed war into a moral crusade where compromise was heresy. This eliminated off-ramps that might have preserved strength or shortened conflict. As the war progressed, ideological rigidity intensified. Failures were blamed on racial weakness or internal enemies rather than flawed strategy. This prevented learning and adaptation. Each setback reinforced belief instead of challenging it. Pragmatism relies on feedback, ideology resists it. The result was a leadership increasingly detached from reality, doubling down on destructive policies even as they undermined military effectiveness. The burden of ideological warfare fell heavily on the German military itself. Soldiers were forced to participate in actions that had no tactical value and eroded discipline. Units tasked with mass killings were diverted from frontline duties. Moral corrosion spread through the ranks, damaging cohesion and focus. Pragmatic warfare seeks efficiency. Ideological warfare spreads contamination through the force. Imperial Germany's war aims were aggressive but finite. Nazi Germany's aims were infinite, bound to a vision of racial reordering that could never be completed. This meant the war had no natural endpoint. Even total victory would not have satisfied ideology, because the ideology required constant enemies. Such a framework guarantees exhaustion. Resources, manpower, and legitimacy are consumed without limit. The substitution of ideology for strategy explains much of Nazi Germany's self-inflicted weakness. Where pragmatism conserves strength, ideology wastes it. Where pragmatism adapts, ideology escalates. Where pragmatism seeks control, ideology seeks purification. The German state that once calculated advantage with cold precision instead pursued a fantasy that demanded endless destruction, turning potential power into liability and ensuring that every conquest carried the seeds of further resistance and collapse. Imperial Germany was built around institutions that existed independently of any single individual. Authority was distributed through systems designed to outlast personalities. The army, the bureaucracy, and the state apparatus functioned according to rules, procedures, and traditions that limited the power of person. Impulse. Discipline in this context did not mean blind obedience to a man, but adherence to a framework. Officers swore loyalty to the state and its institutions, not to the emotions or beliefs of one leader. This created stability, predictability, and continuity even during crisis. Institutional discipline allowed Imperial Germany to coordinate complex actions across vast distances. Orders flowed through established chains of command, and responsibility was clearly defined. When mistakes occurred, they were processed through formal mechanisms. Investigations, reports, and reforms followed. Authority was respected because it was impersonal. Decisions carried weight not because of who issued them, but because of the system behind them. This reduced chaos and limited the damage caused by individual errors. The presence of institutions also acted as a restraint. Commanders operated within boundaries set by doctrine, law, and precedent. Ambition was checked by procedure, even powerful figures encountered limits imposed by tradition and collective judgment. This did not prevent aggression or brutality, but it prevented sudden, irrational shifts in direction. Policy evolved through discussion rather than decree. The system absorbed pressure rather than transferring it directly to subordinates. Nazi Germany dismantled these restraints in favor of personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler. The state was reorganized around the Führer principle, which held that authority flowed downward from one man. Institutions were hollowed out or duplicated by competing organizations loyal directly to Hitler. Overlapping jurisdictions created confusion, not efficiency. Power depended on proximity to the leader rather than on formal role or expertise. Discipline ceased to be institutional and became personal. The cult of personality transformed obedience into devotion. Orders were followed not because they made sense, but because they came from Hitler. Questioning a directive was no longer a professional disagreement, but a moral failure. This eliminated the corrective function institutions are meant to provide. When one man is the ultimate authority, there is no appeal beyond him. Errors compound because they cannot be challenged. This personalization of power encouraged competition rather than coordination. Officials and commanders sought to anticipate Hitler's desires, often exceeding them to prove loyalty. Policies escalated not through rational planning, but through attempts to outdo rivals in ideological commitment. The absence of clear institutional limits rewarded extremism. The system drifted toward radical solutions because moderation carried political risk. Institutional discipline creates consistency.
Personal rule creates volatility. Under Hitler,
Priorities shifted rapidly Bayes, Ed on his mood and perceptions. Long-term planning suffered because no policy was secure. Officials hesitated to commit resources to strategies that might be abandoned suddenly. This unpredictability undermined efficiency and morale. Imperial Germany's institutions provided a steady framework. Nazi Germany's cult of personality created constant uncertainty. The erosion of institutional authority also weakened accountability. When power is concentrated in a system, responsibility can be traced. When power is concentrated in a person, blame becomes diffuse. Failures were attributed to betrayal, incompetence, or sabotage by others, never to the leader's decisions. This encouraged dishonesty and discouraged learning. Without institutional mechanisms to evaluate policy, mistakes were repeated and magnified. The military suffered acutely under this structure. Commanders were no longer professionals operating within a disciplined system, but executors of personal will. Strategic decisions reframed as expressions of loyalty. Promotions and dismissals reflected personal favor rather than performance. This distorted incentives, pushing officers to prioritize political survival over operational effectiveness. Institutional discipline, which once fostered cohesion, was replaced by personal allegiance, which fragmented the command structure. Civil administration mirrored this decay. Ministries competed rather than coordinated. Policies overlapped and conflicted. Efficiency declined as officials focused on demonstrating ideological zeal. The absence of a clear institutional hierarchy meant that problems were solved through access to Hitler rather than through procedure. This bottleneck paralyzed governance. Imperial Germany's bureaucracy, though authoritarian, maintained functional order. Nazi Germany's governance thrived on chaos because chaos preserved personal power. The cult of personality also narrowed the range of acceptable thought. Institutions thrive on expertise, A&D, debate. Personal rule thrives on affirmation. Ideas that challenged the leader's worldview were suppressed. Over time, the state lost its ability to generate innovative solutions. Conformity replaced competence. Institutional memory eroded as experienced officials were removed or marginalized. The system became dependent on the perceptions of a single individual, magnifying his biases. As pressure increased, the weaknesses of personal rule intensified. Institutions that might have absorbed shock no longer functioned. Every crisis became a test of loyalty. Decisions grew more extreme as dissent vanished. The system hardened rather than adapted. Imperial Germany's institutions, for all their flaws, provided resilience through structure. Nazi Germany's cult of personality created brittleness. When the leader's judgment faltered, the entire state faltered with him. The contrast between institutional discipline and personal devotion reveals why one system could endure strain while the other collapsed under it. Institutions distribute power, preserve knowledge, and correct error. Cults of personality concentrate power, erase limits, and silence correction. By dismantling its institutions and elevating one man above all structures, Nazi Germany sacrificed the very mechanisms that could have preserved its strength, leaving a state that appeared unified but was internally hollow, rigid, and unable to recover from its own decisions. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.